Okay, Morgan, George, thank you so much for sitting down with us. We're really excited to be here at BlizzCon and talk to you guys both about the upcoming Dragonflight content and, of course, the War Within. Before we get started, if you both just want to take an opportunity to introduce yourselves.
Sure. I'm George Velev. I'm game producer working on World of Warcraft.
Hello, my name is Morgan Day. I am one of the associate game directors on World of Warcraft.
Great, so we're just going to jump right in then. So we've got a few questions going from Raiding, Mythic Plus, and just general design philosophy, so we're just kind of going to work down the list. So the first question I have for both of you is, with the simultaneous releasing of all raid difficulties, it was initially introduced as an experiment, but as you know, it's been happening again and again. With the upcoming 10.2 release, it's becoming the new norm. So we're sort of interested what sort of measures you look for as success to keep continuing carrying that forward, and what you think overall about the simultaneous raid release difficulty model.
Do you want me to take this?
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that has been the trend with Dragonflight. And, there's a lot of feedback that we've gotten along the way. Certainly there were some concerns with Vault of the Incarnate, with how some of the tuning landed there. But ultimately the team has gotten quite a bit better at that over time. And really, we just love that it really aligns the seasonal launch, right? Like in previous expansions, when we would release the raid, there was always that weird, awkward week where there was a ceiling on your Mythic Plus run, and hey, what level key do I need to run this week to get max vault? So there was always that awkwardness that we felt that aligning this has been a great benefit there. And in terms of measurements in terms of what success looks like, ultimately, we just want to make sure that we're providing the best experience we can across the board, right? And that goes for the Mythic race. The race world first is certainly a big consideration there, but also, there's a tremendous amount of people that are enjoying the raid on normal, and we want to make sure that they're having the best experience as well. So ultimately, we just have to look at what our expectation is in terms of what progression might look like for different audiences versus where we feel like we're landing. And we've been happy with the results there, but also I think we would definitely look at different timing depending on different launch dates. It just so happens that every raid that we've come out with this expansion has been kind of leading up to some kind of other external thing. I heard comments about gosh, I hope we're done by Thanksgiving, right? Whereas hey, I know that's not an international holiday, but certainly that is a holiday for our team. Mm-hmm. So there are things like that are also need to be taken in consideration. It's just, okay, if we delayed a week, what does that actually look like? And where does that align in terms of the schedule versus expectations for, when the raid will be completed? So that's also always taken into consideration as we have, a simultaneous launch versus the staggered launch. Did I hit all the?
I think so.
Okay, yeah, great. No, that's a great answer. So when speaking about the Race to World First Raiders, like you mentioned, we often hear that many of them would love to go into the raid blind as opposed to having to do PTR testing, or because it also cuts down the amount of prep that they have to do. So Sepulcher had 3 untested bosses, and then for many of the final bosses in Dragonflight, they also went untested. So is there a sweet spot for how many bosses you think should be untested versus tested? And for retail, is it possible that sometime in the future we might see something similar to Season of Discovery's Black Fathom Depths, where it's completely untested?
Honestly, yeah, that's the goal, right? We would love for more of our content to be, something that can delight and surprise players versus often, going into the launch of it, it's already kind of been solved, right? But ultimately, there is that audience that, will go to every PTR test, and they will, really dive into every specific of the timing of how the boss plays out. But ultimately, our number one concern is just the quality of the experience, right? We want to make sure that we release the best raid that we can for everyone. But, if we could get to the point where we can hit that quality bar and be really confident that we can achieve that without doing any PTR testing, yeah, I think that would be kind of the dream, as it were. And like you mentioned, I think over time we're building systems and gaining confidence to work in that direction. As you've mentioned yourself, there are fewer bosses being tested than we might have seen in previous expansions. So yeah, I think we're working towards maybe that future, and whether or not we will achieve that is yet to be seen. But for sure, we would love to be able to hit that goal.
It's a very exciting possibility.
One thing I think is really important for PTR, at least for me, is it's also an opportunity to get people's feedback and iterate and pivot when necessary. So someone who focuses more on the class and tuning aspect of things, we heavily leverage PTR, and we look at people's damage and what they're putting on the tier lists and all their guides, and that really helps us sort of make sure that we're on track and gives us opportunity to sort of adjust things when necessary.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is tier lists directly affect how you design the game. That's great to know.
I think they're enjoyable, but I can't speak for the entire team.
A lot of things directly affect how we develop the game, right? Like, to say they directly affect it, that's not too far off. But there's also a broad, range of things that can impact that. But we look at feedback from a number of different places and make sure that we're aligning around what our goals are. And sometimes things that we hear from the players are not, we very much expect to hear the same thing. We're like, yeah, we knew this would happen, and we have to be okay with that. I've said in the past, and I still think it's true. The community's perception of class balance is often very reflective of the content that we're creating, right? Like, we could make 0 class changes from one raid to the next, and those tier lists, as you just quoted, would look wildly different, right? Because it's just, hey, we design our classes to have specific strengths, specific weaknesses, and sometimes there's raids that might not have as much of a specific thing. I think it was, why am I drawing the blank on the name? Avarice.
Yes.
Where people mentioned like single target as something that they called out pretty frequently, and we were like, yeah, that's actually going to have a major impact on class balance. So that's definitely something that we always take into consideration, and our encounter and combat team very frequently are talking to make sure that we're hitting, kind of the goals of what we want with those classes. And there was a conversation that just happened last week where someone was like, hey, what if we don't do, we call it patchwork fights, where it's like, this is single target, there are no ads, just punch the boss. What if we didn't do one of those? And I was like, they're pretty important for just the overall balance of the raid, and the importance of, hey, those single target talents that the combat team made, like, let's make sure they have value and they're interesting. So yeah, the interesting choices are not that interesting if the content doesn't require that you make those changes.
Right. Okay, great. Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. So the last thing I want to touch on directly related to raiding, and George, maybe you can take this one. I'm interested to hear how the development of third-party add-ons and like websites like weakauras, how does that affect encounter design, and how much do you take it into account when you're creating these fights? Like, do you view it as more of an arms race between add-on developers and game developers as to see, like, where eventually do you reach the peak of that mountain, or is it something that you view as like it's more of an accessory and it doesn't really sway your creative decisions too much?
I can't speak for the encounters team. Personally, as someone who does a lot of Mythic raiding, I think they're great tools when used properly. I also think that sometimes they can go a little bit overboard. But in terms of actual design and how they're incorporated into, should we be building a fight with weakauras in mind? Morgan?
Oh, I mean, certainly we have to be aware of what the community is going to do based on feedback, based on what the encounter might require, and ultimately it's our job to make sure that it is never truly like required, right? Like, there's a lot of things that you hear feedback on around readability. That's something that we talk a lot about, right? Like, often when you see these weakauras that are considered required, it's like, well, a lot of that could be boiled down to, hey, we didn't do a great enough job selling the visual, or maybe it's not as clear as it should be. Maybe you didn't have as much time as you would have needed to communicate effectively. Like, hey, you've got this, I've got this, what do we do? Oops, we're dead, Like, you need to make sure that you're designing in that space for those mechanics to really play out in a way that is natural. And we've also, as you've seen, we have made changes to how some of those work, right, with the addition of private auras in Avarice. That's something that we're continuing to leverage in Amir Drasil, and there's actually quite a few more raid encounters and abilities that are leveraging that tech. And we also made changes to the Neltharion kind of mini-map tech, as it were, so that that's not something that will be able to be leveraged moving forward. So people have actually already noticed that in the PTR, and I don't think we messaged that.
No, probably not.
Which was a mistake.
Players will find out.
Oh, they already did. They let us know. We're like, oops, yep, that was intentional. Apologies on our part. So yeah, those are definitely things that that we will make changes as we go. The use of add-ons in World of Warcraft is a very interesting story. It's changed a lot over the years. I played back in Classic when everyone had the macros that would automatically cancel your cast if the target's health was too high, and we made changes to that. So it's a very much an evolving landscape of the game design, and making sure that we're doing our best to make sure that people don't feel like those things are literally required versus things that are really just, in some cases, even accessibility tools.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like, in a lot of ways, World of Warcraft is almost unprecedented with how much the weakauras and stuff can grow, and the developers have to adapt with that. So it's interesting to hear that that's your philosophy.
Yeah, for sure.
So changing gears a little bit over to Mythic Plus. So when Mythic Plus released in Legion, keystones did not go down when they were depleted. They just weren't finished, right? So the system was scrapped back in Legion. Depleted keys were not giving any meaningful score, and there's a lot of community toxicity centered around timing and depleting keys now because of that. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the current consequences of not timing and failing a key, and what you think about that, maybe moving forward, if that's something that needs to change, or if you're kind of happy with where it is now.
Do you want to take a crack, or should I? Yeah, I mean, certainly Mythic Plus is a system that, I'm not sure if you've ever heard the whole story of this, but it was very much a thing that when we added in Legion, we were like, oh, this is an experiment, we'll see how this goes. And it wasn't actually built with the intent of it being evergreen, but after seeing the success of it, it was something that we realized, oh, this is here to stay. Okay, cool. We should be evolving this more. And ultimately, it's an area of the game that we've really been trying to do a lot more, especially with Dragonflight, to support. We're really happy with how, the seasonal model of kind of refurbishing some of our legacy dungeons has played out. That's been really fun to see. But yeah, we're also talking about, other things that we might be able to change along the way, especially in that element of, that way to make Mythic Plus feel more inviting. As we added our own kind of rating system, we wanted to make sure that there was an incentive to bring people who maybe haven't, completed it on that level before. And I think things like that are kind of those social, nods are really valuable. A thing that I talk about all the time, which is I'm not announcing anything, but a thing that I've talked about a lot is like just the existence of a timer, can play a large role in that feeling of that pressure of like, gotta go. And it's like, well, I gotta learn also. So, the timer is something that we talk a lot about is there something that we could look to change or adjust there? Actually, with Delves, with the War Within, that was something that we talked about very early. We're like, okay, no timer in Delves. There will be a progression. We want you to kind of be able to, move through Delves with a progression similar to what you saw with Torghast, but there will be no timer there. And we're still kind of experimenting with other things that may or may not work to kind of fulfill that same role there.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that the invitingness is really important. And a big part of that is combating toxicity. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you often hear about people complaining about other people leaving dungeons mid-run or in the middle of keys, and there's not really a penalty for that in the same way that you would get the Abandoner debuff when you leave a heroic dungeon or anything that you queue up for. So, especially in pugs, if you have someone leave, they don't get the debuff, and then the rest of the group decides to continue the dungeon, and they clear it, and they get the reward, and it's possible that person that left could end up getting the reward. So, we heard just a few days ago that there might be a change coming to punish key leavers, and I wanted to know if you could tell me anything more about that.
Do you have any
I don't have anything specific to announce.
Yeah, I don't think I have any news on that. There's a lot of my focus lately has been on War Within and, a lot of the cool updates and developments there. And I know our Encounter team has definitely been talking about that a lot. That's always something that's at front of mind. So I'll have to follow up on that one. I'm not exactly sure what the specific plans are, but yeah, I mean, that, ability to make people feel like, this is an investment. We're in this journey together is something that is always at front of mind. And I know we've also been looking at ways that we can add new tools for the players to make sure that, really a major element of making sure that, your run goes smoothly is to make sure we're all aligned on our expectations, right? Like if you're looking to push really hard and I just want to get my Great Vault progression, we have very misaligned expectations. So that can lead to, a misunderstanding or some problems that might pop up in the group. So making sure that we're providing the tools to make sure that we're connecting players who have similar goals is definitely a major thing that we talk about often, and things that we often have other ideas we would love to explore in the game as well.
Okay, great. Well, I'm excited to learn more in the future. Speaking of the future, we obviously know that there's 8 new dungeons coming with the War Within, a lot of new Mythic Plus possibilities. I wanted to know if you could tell me a little bit more about the future of Mythic Plus, and specifically if we'll see any changes to affixes, like maybe rotating out old ones, bringing in new ones, things like that. And also if you've thought about an expanding cosmetic system for Mythic Plus, more in line with, like PvP, for example, with the Gladiator transmogs and things like that, or maybe even challenge modes like in Mr. Pandaria.
Sorry, so there's multiple parts to that question. So the first one is any affix changes in Mythic Plus? I don't know off the top of my head. I know that affixes are always kind of an ever-evolving element of Mythic Plus. Something that has been a bit of a shift for us is there has always been this like major focus on the individual affixes and the importance of them, and really something that I feel like the team is learning and still kind of discussing is with the dungeon pool changing out every single season, there's not as much of a focus on those affixes, right? Like philosophically, we want to make sure that we're spending a lot of time looking at the individual dungeons, because that's something that is really fun to learn and progress and figure out how to move through this new dungeon, and let the individual mechanics that make these dungeons feel so unique, like some of the examples I used about like, oh, there's a cool light mechanic. And when you are seeing that for the first time, we'd rather you focus on learning that element of the game instead of so much of the focus being on these affixes, which are really just there to kind of like lightly change things up week over week to make sure that there's still something to learn and that is a little bit different. But for so long with Mythic Plus, so much focus was on the affixes. We're really philosophically trying to slowly and gradually shift that focus into the dungeon changes that are happening. I think with season 3 that's coming out most recently, like there's so many cool changes. Like Throne of the Tides is like an entirely new dungeon at this point. I love that we're using I think it was like a raid boss at one point is now just like a mechanic in a hallway that kind of bites you. I'm like, this is so cool. It feels like an entirely different space, and that's really the area that we would want to make sure that we're spending a lot of our development time on, is making sure these dungeons feel unique and fun, and not spending as much time really laser focusing on affixes.
Okay, great. And any plans for the cosmetic changes, if anything, like similar to PvP?
Do you know?
Nothing planned for now that I'm aware of. This is something that we can announce today.
Okay.
I've definitely heard the feedback though about just that desire for more exciting cosmetic things to chase, and something that I definitely think that there's space to explore is right now when it comes to Mythic Plus and a lot of the achievements and rating, it's kind of backloaded, right? Like there's a lot of cool things that you get when you get to 2000 plus, and it's like there's a whole lot of space before you get to 2000 that we could be using. Like we mentioned, trying to incentivize people to give the system a try. That would be much more, a lower barrier to entry to kind of earn some of those things. I love pointing at the the vicious mounts in PvP, where if you just gain honor through battlegrounds or something, there's a really fun mount that you can earn every season. Something like that could be fun to explore, but nothing to announce right now. But definitely agree that there's space to discuss there on our side.
Okay, great. So the last thing I want to talk about in Mythic Plus is balance. So I want to briefly bring up augmentation. Sure. So currently, augmentation provides a lot of survivability and healing output to the Mythic Plus group, and it's very, very powerful. And a lot of groups may even consider it to be mandatory. So how do you plan on addressing the inherent advantages of having a support spec in the current state of the game? And just sort of how you feel about the overall health of the game in that regard.
Well, I think adding a new spec in the middle of the expansion, one that is in Euro for the first time, was a huge endeavor, and I think we're really happy with how it turned out. Of course, there are opportunities to make it better. And like you mentioned, looking at how Mythic Plus sort of transpired with the initial adding of augmentation, it was definitely focused more on utility than actual sort of throughput. Thankfully, when we built out the spec in the first place, we gave ourselves a lot of tuning knobs to sort of adjust things up and down. With that being said, we will still be looking at Season 3 Mythic Plus, and much like we did in sort of halfway through Season 2, we will take measures when necessary.
There's a bunch of changes in Guardians of the Dream with augmentation, right?
There's a few, yeah. We're definitely hitting some of their throughput potential.
Yeah, I mean, like George mentioned, one of the major goals of augmentation when we added it was, I like to talk about how, there are the player types that just want to help their friends, right? Like I just want to be, supporting my allies, and I don't want to really be tanking or be DPSing things, and often that leads to play a healing role, but healing can be really hard. Sometimes I just want to be able to fulfill that role of helping my allies without needing to be in that healing role. And like George mentioned, there's a lot of different knobs that we have for augmentation. So, right now, like you mentioned, they bring a ton of utility, and also they contribute to a lot of damage. Well, we want to look at what of augmentation is really feels unique and fun to explore. So there's definitely things that we can do to tune. Maybe we tune the damage down a little bit, where they still bring some great support because that's something that is unique to that role. And there are trade-offs there between, hey, yeah, this role makes it a little bit easier for my healer, but maybe they're not contributing as much as they are right now. Certainly, I know we've said in the past, it was very much not a coincidence that we released augmentation when we did in the Fractures of Time update, right? We wanted to give ourselves a lot of time to learn the lessons of how this is going to impact Mythic Plus, how this is going to impact Raid, so that we can really take a fresh look at a new season with changes along the way that go with that.
Yeah. And it's certainly a careful balance, because the last thing we want to do is turn it into a not-support spec, right? So.
Right. Okay. So moving away from the balance of augmentation and kind of getting more towards the technical back end of it, it was stated when augmentation came out that it wanted to have great support for accurately delivering the information for how it performs.
Yeah.
And we were wondering if you had any sort of feelings on the current state of that, and if there are any intentions to maybe push it towards a more accurately portraying how exactly they're performing both in and out of game.
Is this in regard to logging, or just in
just in terms of API in general?
Sure. We've made a lot of changes since 7.15 to make logging more accurate. And I think we have a few more things that we need to sort of iron out. But overall, I think we're happy with how it logs out of clients. But in client and sort of like seeing it in real time, we don't really have any plans to make it look like a full DPS. Fundamentally, it is a support spec, so we want to make sure that the specs that it's supporting are the ones sort of shining. But for players who do want a more in-depth look at, how much does my Ebonite uptime affect the damage of this outlaw rogue, they have tools for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, really, that was the thing that we talked a lot about was, how do I know I'm a good augmentation evoker, right? Like, how do I measure my success? And that was something that we've talked a lot about, and making sure that we, have the ability for players to understand that in game, right? Like that Ebonite bar was something that I would say we're pretty well into development of augmentation. We're like, we really need something where I can like gauge, okay, as long as my uptime here is good, I feel good. So that's definitely something that has been a major focus of ours as well.
Okay, great. So changing gears a little bit, I want to jump towards a more story-related question. So the War Within returns us back to Azeroth, like we've learned. We're going back, but it's not quite clear how we'll get there from where we currently are in the current story. So we know that Firehawk is going to be the final boss of 10.2, but there's still a lot left undiscovered about the plans and goals for the Primal Incarnates and sort of where we're going to go from this isolated story of Dragonflight into this epic 3 expansion log saga. So can you tell us a little bit more about the developments of Dragonflight and the War Within and how they kind of tie into each other?
That is a great question. I'm not sure how much I want to spoil.
Yeah, I mean, what's the point? We can't spoil it for our players, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, like we said in the past, there's definitely more story to tell after the Guardians of the Dream update, and a lot of that story is going to be dealing with kind of that bridge between where we are now and, kind of what we saw in the cinematic with Thrall and Anduin, and we saw in the features trailer with, everyone's kind of seeing these visions, and what's the deal with that, and how does that kind of come to be? So that will definitely play a major role of our kind of what catapults us into the War Within. But I don't want to do any spoilers there, but there's definitely plans to make sure that is clear to players.
Okay, great. So earlier you mentioned that Throne of Tides is essentially a new dungeon at this point, which is true, and it's great that it's coming back. And of course, we're going back to the old world, which is very, very exciting. So I sort of wanted to get your general feelings and sort of plans on if we're going back to the old world, do you have any plans to modernize old content, maybe previous dungeons and previous raids as a general practice going forward? And if you think we'll be seeing a lot of that, or if it's like an every once in a while treat?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we talk about often, is just like what a strength it is of World of Warcraft to have all this amazing content, right? We've got, these dungeons that I think are a lot of fun. Cataclysm, as we've learned, are really cool, but they do need a bit of updating, as we saw with Throne of the Tides and some of our other Cata dungeons that we've launched. And yeah, honestly, I think that's something that we are planning to continue to explore, right? Like, just there's this massive, amount, this library of awesome legacy content that's still really fun. It's just a matter of what can we do to make that feel more modern and, maybe make it more rewarding to play. And, we kind of started to dip our toes into the water with like Chromie Time, for instance, where you can level through old expansions and make that feel like relevant content. We've been doing a lot of really fun stuff with some of those time walking events that pop up and make some of that older content more relevant. And that's definitely a space that we feel like there's a lot of kind of fertile ground to explore and continue to look into other things that we can leverage there. time walking raids, are something that we've explored with in the past, but ultimately I feel like, right now those are kind of at a normal raid difficulty, and that's, they don't have any scaling beyond that. So that's definitely an area that we think there's still more to be explored there in terms of like, how do we make that feel more modern and relevant as we move forward. But yeah, there's definitely a lot that we want to do with those plans, and, are making kind of forward progress and baby steps as we go.
Okay, great. That's very exciting. We're getting pretty close to the end here, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'll hit you with one more question. So in many ways, Dragonflight has been considered the beginning of a new era for WoW, and it's the first time we've seen multiple substantive patches within the introduction of the 0.7 update cycle, and 3 expansions at once. So it really feels like all engines are firing in terms of cadence and content for World of Warcraft, which is great. But I wanted to know if you could give me any insight on how this has changed the development space, and how this was made possible with the War Within, Midnight, The Last Titan, and just like how it's sort of changed how you operate on the back end in terms of creating World of Warcraft.
That's a great question. Do you want to take it?
I think for me, and I've been on the team for a few years now, but it kind of started in the middle of Shadowlands, where we took some time to sort of reassess and see where we are and take a lot of community feedback, and use that as sort of like the bouncing point for a lot of what we're doing in War Within. It's been really interesting to try to sort of do more frequent updates. Like as a producer, it's been a fun puzzle to sort of put together. But it's been really rewarding seeing players react so positively to it. So yeah, it's been definitely a shift in how we produce the game. But based off players' reactions, like it seems like a good shift to me.
Yeah, there's always, we like to say we always try to get content into our players' hands at a very, responsible and, rewarding pace. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned. We've been making World of Warcraft for 20 years. We hope to be making it for 20 more. But we're constantly learning new lessons as we're, developing the game. And as we move quicker, we find things that are like, oh, hey, we didn't do that time. Let's make sure we put that down and make sure we're absorbing that into our process to make sure we don't have some of those changes or misses moving forward. So, it's an ever-evolving thing. That's one of the most amazing things about working on World of Warcraft is the game looks very different today than it did 20 years ago, and I imagine in another 20 years it'll look equally as different. And, that really is, an exciting thing to be a part of and constantly see the game evolving and changing. And that includes, the processes on our end. They look very different today than when they did 20 years ago, and that will continue to change over time, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, and so much of it is based on player feedback. Like, last night I read, 3 hours of, Reddit, Discord, forums, and Monday morning I'm going to go and talk to the team and be like, all right, let's see how things, shook up. What are we happy with? What are things that we think we can improve? So yeah, it's really, I would say, thanks to just the overwhelming amount of player feedback that we're sort of where we are today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Ian mentioned that even today during the deep dive, he made to caveat the heck out of hero talents. This is early, we're going to change. We want to get this into our players' hands as quickly as possible to leave us with as much time as we can to make changes based on that player feedback. And, that's one of my favorite things about, anytime we have a new update that we announce is so fun to see, what resonates with players versus what we thought was going to be really, exciting for people, and maybe it doesn't quite land. So we always try to be agile and listen to community feedback and look at areas where we can continue to, double down in some places where it's really exciting, or maybe revisit some decisions that weren't as popular. A very recent example with Guardians of the Dream, there was the Pathfinder where it's kind of funny how it's changed now. Pathfinder is now the TBC turning on, and you've been able to Dragon Ride, but now you can TBC fly. There was a renown requirement on that, and we very quickly heard feedback from players that was a bit unexpected. So, making that change as quickly as we did was something that, we didn't take lightly, but was also something that we felt was the right decision based on community feedback and kind of where the game is today versus what it looked like, way back in, other previous expansions where Pathfinder meant a lot more than it does, in Dragonflight.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, I think it's fair to say that community reception so far has been pretty positive. I'm definitely excited. I can't wait to, learn more and get my hands on it and play it myself. But yeah, it's been a great interview. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Morgan, George, I appreciate your time. Yeah, it was a great meeting.